we start a new day, even though they were previously sworn. So, do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, Your Honor.
And once again, could you state your name and spell your last name for the record?
Charles Scammell, S-C-A-M-M-E-L-L.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Morrison.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Scammell.
Good morning.
My name is Martin Morris, and I'm an attorney, and I represent Mr. Stangeland. Prior to coming to New Jersey from Missouri, as you have corrected me, you, I assume, had conversation with a number of people involved in law enforcement about this particular incident, correct?
Correct.
Did you ever become aware that reports of law enforcement had been generated as a result of their investigations?
Indirectly, yes.
Did you ever have an opportunity to either obtain copies of those reports or to review them?
No.
When you got to New Jersey, I guess earlier this month, when would that have been that you arrived here?
I arrived here on Sunday afternoon of this week.
And after you arrived here, did you have an opportunity to meet with First Assistant Prosecutor Gregory Mueller or Ms. Brenner?
I did.
Did you also meet with any of the investigators from their office?
I just had passed anywhere around them at the meeting. No.
How about any other members of New Jersey law enforcement while you were here since Sunday?
No, sir.
So in the course of your conversations with both Mr. Mueller and Ms. Brenner, would I be correct that they discussed your proposed testimony that you would offer here in court?
Yes.
And did they tell you what you should say?
No.
When you came to court yesterday, you testified, let's call it approximately an hour, am I correct?
It seemed like 5 hours.
You testified yesterday, correct?
Yes, I did.
And was that consistent with what you had told Mr. Mueller and Ms. Brenner your testimony would be?
I'm assuming yes. It was the truth as I remembered it.
And you had not taken any notes that you kept concerning this incident, am I correct?
No, sir.
And your testimony yesterday then would have been from recollection?
Yes, sir.
Now, in the course of your testimony, you discussed an individual by the name of Roy Slates.
Yes, sir.
You, I assume, knew Mr. Slates because your wife of 50 years, Linda, had worked for him in the 1990s, correct?
Briefly, yes.
She had been a bookkeeper for him.
I think she was assistant. She worked there maybe 6 months or so, something like that.
And what year would that have been approximately, if you know?
Sir, I'm guessing, I can't really recall. I would say maybe 1995 or 6, somewhere there.
And
That might have been later than that. I don't really recall.
I see. It was certainly before the incident in November of 2009, however,
Oh,
correct?
yes, yes, yes.
And she had not been employed by him for at least several years prior to that.
Correct.
Had you had any contact with Mr. Slates following your wife's ceasing being in his employment?
Oh, just yes, some. Briefly, he was helping us develop a wastewater plant out on a project in Utah as a contractor. He helped us get a contract from out of Iowa to do some dirt work for us.
Out of Iowa to do some dirt work, you said?
Pardon me?
You said out of Iowa to do some dirt work?
Yes.
Thank you.
And
I might say Mr. Slates was very helpful on our project. He was.
so aside from the project in Utah, you had some other projects that you worked with him on?
Not really. I mean, that was the only project that he was trying to help us. He wasn't a business partner in it or anything. It was just a contracting relationship.
And did Mr. Slates, when your wife worked for him, have an office or a business location?
Yeah, they had an office there right in downtown Nevada, Missouri.
And I believe you said that the town that you lived in was a short distance from Nevada?
About 15 miles.
And that 15 miles, is that highway miles?
Yes.
With regard to his office, could you describe to me what it was he had?
just typical office. I mean, I don't know how, explain to me how it should, I don't know how to describe that.
Was it a commercial complex where you would keep equipment, a garage, or was it an office?
It was just an office, it wasn't a shop or anything like that.
At some point in time, you met an individual in some fashion, and his name was Jeffrey Muller, correct?
Correct.
And you determined that Mr. Muller was at that time from the state of New Jersey, correct?
Correct.
And did you meet Mr. Muller personally at any time in the state of Missouri?
No,
I believe you said you might have met him in a trip in Utah?
no,
So you never personally met with Mr. Muller until you went to his office in New Jersey at some point?
correct.
Now, when you met him, he was introduced to you by another business associate or someone you knew, correct?
Correct.
And who was that?
Art Lackman.
And Mr. Lackman, was he the individual who was from Utah, or was he the individual who was from California?
He was from San Francisco.
And what was the individual's name who owned the bar and the motel in Utah?
It wasn't a bar, it was just a hotel and a motel and a restaurant.
A motel and a restaurant. What was his name?
Mr. Al Foster.
Okay. Now, at the point when you made contact with Roy Slates and put him in touch with Jeffrey Muller, can I assume then that that was mostly handled by telephone calls?
Yes,
Were any of those calls between Mr. Muller and Mr. Slates conference calls that you participated in?
no,
Was there ever any documentation that you recall generated by you to Mr. Muller about the possible transaction?
not that I recall. I mean, there might have been, but I just don't recall it. There might have been a document nothing that I recall, but I can't say that absolutely.
At some point in time, during the course of all of these events, did you learn that Mr. Slates claimed that Mr. Muller had arranged to receive money from Mr. Slates?
Yes, I did know that.
And did you come to know approximately what that amount might have been?
I did not know that.
And I believe yesterday when you testified, you indicated that you were not aware that Mr. Slates had made a claim that Mr. Muller had basically taken advantage of him with regard to this deal?
I don't think I made that statement yesterday.
Okay. So did you know that Mr. Slates had made a claim against Mr. Muller because of the transaction?
Yes, I knew that probably in 2001 or 2 or somewhere in there.
And at some point in time, you had a conversation with Mr. Muller, you indicated, and it would have been after the events happened in November of 2009, as I understand it, correct?
Immediately after.
Immediately would be within a few days?
It was about a week after I got out of the hospital.
And you were in the hospital from until Friday, I believe you said.
That's correct.
So approximately a week after that, you contacted Mr. Muller?
Roughly, and it could have been 2 weeks, but it was in that time frame.
And basically, your reason for contacting him was to basically give him a warning about what had happened to you?
Yes,
And you also had conversation with him, as I understand it, at that time, about some other transactions, am I correct?
at that time, no.
Did you discuss with him who might have been a possible perpetrator concerning the incident that had occurred to you in November?
My conversation with him is I had no clue who they were, but his name was involved, and I felt like that he was in danger, and he should be aware.
Didn't he mention to you another individual by the name of King?
Not that I recall.
I see. At some point in time, in January of 2010, you were made aware of the arrest of Mr. Stangeland and 2 other individuals, am I correct?
I was made aware of that, yes, in January, about the 10th or 11th or somewhere in there.
And at that point in time, you were brought into the sheriff's office in Vernon County, Missouri, to be interviewed, correct?
It's somewhere in that period, yes, I don't know the exact day.
And you met with a detective from the Vernon County Sheriff's Office, as I recall?
I think there was probably a couple of them in there.
You remember John Randall?
Yes,
And did you know John Randall before this occasion?
no,
And did Mr. Randall conduct an interview with you?
I believe it was John Randall, yes.
And do you know whether or not that interview was recorded?
I'm assuming it was, but I wasn't maybe aware of it at the time, but they probably told me it was, but it's been too long ago for me to remember that.
From your answer, can I assume then that you have not had an opportunity to review that recording if one was made?
That's correct.
With regard to January 2010 versus November of 2009, would you say that your recollection of the events that happened in November of 2009 were as fresh in January as they were in November?
That was a difficult period for me. My mind was all over the place in that period of time because we were concerned about having another attack on our house and our person, and we didn't know where these individuals were broke in, so it was a very troubling period for us.
In the course of your initial investigation of events, was that completed by the Vernon County Sheriff's Department, to your knowledge?
The initial on
In November of 2009.
well, I didn't actually interview with them until the 13th. I didn't get out of the hospital until then.
I see. Were you interviewed in the hospital at some point in time by a law enforcement officer?
Absolutely, I was. Two detectives from the Joplin, I believe they were the police department, it might have been the sheriff's department. And I was waiting to go into surgery, and the doctor asked me if I would talk to him, and I said, yes, I would, but I'm not gonna be held accountable for what I say because I had a lot of painkillers in me, and I don't even remember the conversation.
How about after you got out of the hospital and you had the interview with the Vernon County Sheriff's Department, week or so afterward? I think you said it might have been after you got out of the hospital?
It was on yeah, I think it was like I believe it was almost like, I'm thinking it was on like the 23rd or something like that. I got out of the hospital on the 13th, or maybe it was before that, I don't really remember.
When you gave your statements to the officers at that occasion following the events, the ones to the Vernon County Sheriff's Department officers, do you know whether that was recorded?
I do not, sir.
Were you on painkillers and unable to adequately answer questions when you gave that interview?
I was on a lot of pain medication, and I was, that evening, I do know it was a long day because I'd gone back to visit the doctor, and it was at the end of the day, and I was absolutely running out of steam. I do remember that.
In your testimony yesterday, you indicated that it was your recollection that it was the bigger of the three individuals who fired the shotgun at you that resulted in the loss of your fingers, correct?
Yes, sir, but I think in my initial statement, the guns were so close to me, the two individuals, Mr. Stangeland and Mr. Swarn, were closer than that desk to me, and the guns were like that close together. I mean, so I remember a few things, but the confusion of the moment with the gun exploding and being hit and being spun around in the room, I mean, it was kind of a blur.
Well, when you gave your statement, were things still a blur at that point in time?
When I gave my statement,
In November of 2009?
you know, I don't recall. I mean, I really don't recall.
Where were you when you gave the statement?
At the sheriff's office.
And do you remember John Randall being present at that point?
I think John Randall and Steve Schlup both were there, I
And
believe.
Steve Smith, did you say?
Pardon?
Steve who?
Schlup.
Schlo. Okay, thank
Did you know Steve Schlup before that occasion?
No, sir.
So these were two individuals you had not met before then.
Correct.
And when you met with them, do you have a recollection of telling Officer Randall that the bigger suspect always kept his finger outside the trigger guard and that the gun was in his left hand? You remember telling the officer that?
Yes, yeah, I do recall that.
Is that true?
Yeah, I believe it is, but to be honest, I don't absolutely recall 100%.
Would you say that on the day that you gave that statement in November of 2009, your recollection would have been clearer than perhaps today?
Possibly.
Is there any reason why you would believe you would have given an untruthful statement to Officer Randall or to Officer Schlick?
Please ask that again.
Would you have any reason why you might have given an untruthful statement to either of those two officers at that time?
Are you saying, would I purposely give a false answer to a question?
Either purposely or for some reason that you negligently gave that answer?
Not to my, I mean, I might have misspoken, but no, I certainly didn't misspeak on purpose.
Would you have made up a statement that the bigger suspect always kept his finger outside the trigger guard and the gun was in his left hand on the day you gave the statement?
You mean, are you saying would I fabricate that?
Yes.
No.
Do you know any reason why Officer Randall might have had a reason to put something in a report that might not have been said by you?
I wouldn't think that he would do that, but I don't know that.
Do you recall telling Officer Randall that your observation was that the smaller suspect kept the gun in his right hand and his finger on the trigger the whole time during the assault?
I do remember that.
Is that true?
Yes, it is true.
Okay. And you told Officer Randall that?
Yes, sir.
And your recollection would have been clear on the November date when you gave that statement to him, correct?
Yes, sir.
With regard to your statement in court was that it was Mr. Stangeland who had shot you, and you were pretty clear about that fact yesterday. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In your same report to Officer Randall in November of 2009, you described the three individuals who had entered your home on the 9th of November. Am I correct?
On what day did you say?
The date when you were interviewed, I believe the 9th of November is the date of the alleged assault, correct?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
In the first interview I had with him, whatever date that was.
Okay. Whenever that date was, and you had that interview, you described the three individuals, and I'm going to use in general terms, correct?
Correct.
You said one of them was the big guy.
Yes.
He would be taller and about 250 pounds, as I recall your description.
Correct.
6'2" or greater.
Yes.
And then there was the shorter guy who was heavy set of the two, correct?
Yes.
Two older guys, as you described it.
Yes, sir.
And then there was the young, thinner, skinnier guy.
Yes.
Okay. So, referring to Mr. Stangeland, which of those three would have been Mr. Stangeland?
The big guy.
And which would have been a person who you ultimately learned was Lonnie Swartz?
Pardon?
You ultimately learned that one of the individuals was named Lonnie Swartz,
Yeah,
correct?
the shorter one.
Okay. The shorter of the two adults?
Yes.
Okay. And Lonnie Swartz was not the younger of them, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the two individuals that you described that you saw with shotguns who were about as far away as the table is from where you are now, that was Mr. Stangeland and Mr. Swartz you ultimately learned?
Correct.
Okay. Now, were you ever shown a lineup of pictures to identify Mr. Stangeland as one of the individuals who had been there?
No.
Were you ever shown a photograph of him before you came to New Jersey?
I've seen several photographs in the paper. I've seen him in a courtroom in Vernon County.
I see.
And I've seen him on several occasions.
Right. In your statement given to John Randall in November of 2009, do you recall telling John Randall that the shorter guy shot you?
Yes, I remember saying that.
And today you are suggesting that it wasn't the shorter guy, that it was actually Mr. Stangeland.
That's correct.
Now, do you recall being interviewed by John Randall in January, particularly January 14th or so of 2010, after the arrest of Mr. Stangeland, Sworns, and Waddell?
Yes, on the 10th, was it 9th or 10th?
And do you recall in that particular statement, which was recorded, I suggest, again telling Officer Randall that it was the shorter of the people, the two guys, the two older guys, that actually shot you. Do you remember that?
I believe that at the time.
And that would have been several months after the alleged assault occurred in November, that you were still saying it was the shorter guy.
Yes, 2 months later.
And at some point in time, you learned the identity of Mr. Stangeland because law enforcement told you his name, correct?
Yes, and it was in the paper also.
And you didn't learn his identity because of your own efforts, correct?
No.
And when was it that you changed your mind that it was Mr. Stangeland who shot you as opposed to Mr. Swartz?
After I really thought about the evening, and what led me to believe that initially was when I was shot and I went down, all I could hear was an explosion. I was hit. I looked at my hand, it was blown apart, and I was trying to figure out what happened, and I asked, why did you do that? Why did you shoot me? And Mr. Stangeland said, because he pointed to Mr. Swartz, told you to sit down. And at that time, the impact, I couldn't tell which barrel it came out of because they were so close together. But I was going on what Mr. Stangeland told me when he said, because he told you to sit down, I just assumed that he, being the one that shot me, that's why he shot me, because I wouldn't sit down.
I see. So your conclusion that Mr. Stangeland shot you rather than Mr. Swartz is based upon an assumption as to how you interpreted a comment made by Mr. Stangeland.
No, my assumption that maybe I missed, say that again, please.
Okay, I'll try.
Let me help you. What I meant to say was the reason I initially thought that Mr. Swartz shot me was when I asked, why did you shoot me? I was told by Mr. Stangeland because he, Mr. Swartz, told you to sit down. And when he said he, and the gun impacts were so close together, I just assumed that the he was the one that shot me.
And when you say the he was the one that shot you, meaning you assumed it was Mr. Swartz?
Correct.
Okay. Now, at some point in time, did you learn that Mr. Stangeland had indicated to law enforcement that he had been the one who shot you?
I did hear that.
And when was that?
I don't recall. It was sometime after, obviously after the 10th of January in 2010, but I don't know exactly what day it was.
Is it possible that because of the statement made to you by law enforcement about Mr. Stangeland admitting he had shot you may have changed your mind?
No, what really changed my mind was in a courtroom when Mr. Stangeland was in the courtroom in Vernon County requesting to be allowed to go see his father who was terminally ill. That in the Vernon County courtroom where the jury box is, the prisoners come in and out right along the front rail. My wife and myself and a newspaper reporter were sitting right on the front rail. When Mr. Stangeland left the courtroom that day, he came right in front of us and he turned to me and he said, "I'm sorry." And at that time I knew for sure it was him, and it was a gesture that I appreciated, to be quite honest with you. But that's when I knew for sure it was him.
That would have been in January of 2010 when he said, "I'm sorry."
No, it was later. It was a little bit later than that because it was when Mr. Stangeland's father was ill. It was in a court procedure for him to request time to go see his father before he passed. And I think that might have been in March or much later, I don't know when that was.
But in 2010.
Correct.
And you would attend court sessions because of your personal interest in the case?
Yes, yes.
Do you recall that he was granted a furlough to see his father at that point?
Yes, I believe it was arranged so he could do that.
Do you recall telling Officer Randall at one point in time that it was your belief that Mr. Stangeland had shot you by accident?
I think what I said, I don't know what ended up in the report, I think what I said was, at first I wanted to believe that maybe the shooting was accidental, except that when I asked, why did you shoot me, I was told it was because you got shot because you wouldn't sit down. And I assumed that was no accident.
So it was based upon your interpretation of the statement Mr. Stangeland made to you that you determined it was not an accident?
Yes, when he told me you got shot because you wouldn't sit down, that indicated to me quite clearly it was not an accident.
Did someone ask you to sit down?
Yes.
And I assume you didn't?
No. And let me clarify that. All I simply, when I was told to sit down, again, Judge, if I could stand up?
Yes, please.
All I said, I was standing there facing them, the guns were closer than we are. They were this close to the edge of that desk. And I was told to sit down, and I said, what do you want? And the next thing I know, I was hit here and on my hip, which spun me around clockwise under the middle of the floor. And that's when I got up, and I said, why did you shoot me? And there was no hesitation. He said, because Mr. Stangeland said, because he told you to sit down.
Thank you. With regard to your subsequent involvement in Mr. Stangeland's proceedings, which occurred in Vernon County, I assume court equivalent to this one, that you were attending.
Yes.
Do you know whether or not he has ever been charged with anything as a result of the home invasion?
I've never testified in a proceeding where Mr. Stangeland was involved. I was testified in a hearing for Mr. Barber, and I was present. The only other time I was present when on a couple of pleadings, and I was present when Mr. Stangeland was requesting a furlough to see his father.
And do you know from your information whether or not Mr. Stangeland or any of the other three were ever indicted by a grand jury for any of the events that happened in November of 2009?
I don't know the legalese of all that. I don't know that.
Would it be fair to say that you haven't testified in any proceedings since 2010?
Correct. And I just testified in one, and that was Mr. Barber's, a hearing for Mr. Barber.
Now, Officer Randall asked you in your interview in January of 2010 whether or not you knew a person named William Barger, am I correct?
Correct.
And at that point in time, if I recollect your answer, you indicated you did not know him.
That's correct.
You were familiar with the area in Nevada and people who were involved in business there, correct?
A little bit, but I didn't spend that much time. I live north of town, and all my time was spent in Kansas City.
Did you know Mr. Stangeland before that
No, I
occasion?
did not. I might have met him one time, but I'd forgotten. One of my wife's brother-in-law did some work for Mr. Stangeland in one of his businesses, and I think I met him when he built that project, and it was like in the early 90s, but
Built that project where? I'm sorry, when he built that project?
the project is called the Tobacco Shack in Nevada, Missouri, but that was in the early 90s. I did not recall him.
When you came to New Jersey, in your testimony, you indicated that you came here for the purpose of meeting with Jeffrey Muller, correct?
Say that again, please.
Okay, back in the 90s, You visited New Jersey,
Oh, yes,
correct? I'm
yes,
sorry.
yes.
And your purpose in coming here was to visit with Jeffrey Muller, correct?
Correct.
What was it that you were concerned about that necessitated you coming to New Jersey to see him?
He was trying to arrange for funding on a project, one of the projects out in Utah, and I just wanted to see whether it was real or not, and I concluded it probably wasn't. That's when I decided to go on with my life and get into the construction business.
When you decided it wasn't real, did you mean the project wasn't real, or that Mr. Muller's ability to put up money or get money put up for the project wasn't
I
real?
just didn't believe that the funding was there for the project. The project was real.
You were asked, when you were interviewed by Officer Randall, about other transactions that you had been involved in indirectly or directly with Mr. Jeffrey Muller. And I believe you answered that none of those had actually ever panned out into a loan, to your knowledge.
That's correct.
Was that a truthful statement?
Yes.
So there was more than one deal that you had perhaps put people in touch with Mr. Muller to try to do a transaction?
No, I was just involved with him, helping the group that I was with.
Mr. Slates, at some point indicated that he was trying to raise money through Mr. Muller for a project in Utah. Are you aware of that?
And I think it was the project he was gonna build for us on a wastewater treatment plant.
So he needed to get financing, I assume, to be able to fund the project that he had to complete.
That he had. I wasn't involved in that project.
And it would have been related to the same Utah project that you were.
Yes, it would have been built on that property, but it was a wastewater treatment plant that I believe he was doing with a company called Waterlink out of Akron, Ohio.
It was a golf course, as I
It
recall.
was a
you
golf
saying.
course around it, but it was the Waterlink project was to reclaim wastewater to water the golf course.
When you testified yesterday, you said you came to New Jersey back in the 90s to meet Mr. Muller, and you went to Fort Lee, New Jersey. Do you recollect that?
It was in the Fort Lee, it was a town, I think Fairlawn or Fairview or Fair something.
I see.
It's right there by Fort Lee, right?
So yesterday, when you testified, you came to Fort Lee, you meant the Fort Lee area.
Correct.
And had you been there before that occasion?
No.
Have you been there since?
No.
Sunday, was that the first time you came back to New Jersey since you had come to see Mr. Muller in Fort Lee in the 90s?
That's correct.
And did you visit him at an office,
Visit.
Mr. Muller?
Oh, yeah.
Was it that you met in a diner or in a
No,
restaurant?
he had an office, a typical commercial office. You can't really describe it, I know it was all elevated, the parking was underneath it.
Did it have a sign that said Blue Chip Investments or some name like that?
I don't recall that, I'm assuming that it did, but I don't recall that.
Do you recall that was the trade name he used?
Yes, it was.
With regard to your visit there, you had a discussion with him about the particular project that you went to talk to him about, correct?
Correct.
And as a result of it, I assume at some point you left and you went back to Missouri,
Correct.
and maybe ultimately back to Utah to talk to individuals there.
Yeah, we kind of started wrapping it up because it looked like it wasn't, everything was there except the funding to do it.
And you had taken a financial beating as a result of your involvement in that project, as I understand it, but it wasn't money necessarily out of your own pocket, it was the time you invested that you had lost?
Time and money. I mean, I didn't invest money in it, but I was financing my own time out there, so,
And cost to fly there, do what you had to do?
yeah.
Sure. When you called Mr. Muller in 2009, after the incident occurred at your home, you got his phone number through another individual, am I correct?
No, I got it, I Googled it.
I see. And you came up with Jeffrey Muller in New Jersey?
I came up with the same number, Blue Chip Capital, was still, that's the number I called and I got it.
I see. How long was your conversation with him that day, if you recall?
I don't, I was just, I mean, my whole purpose of calling him was try to get his attention, to let him know that this is a very serious situation, that there were 3 individuals out there with, that were wanting to do some harm to him. and were capable of doing that harm, and I wasn't sure he was listening to me, and I just said, look, I don't want it on my conscience, I just want you to know that there's a danger